it's been quite a long journey for me as well, learning about kelp. And one of the people who's helped me learn about kelp, and certainly its importance in the Highland communities, was getting to know and talk to Cathy Dagg. And it was great when a few years ago now, Cathy started this project off. And with the Coigach and Asint Living Landscape Project, who's kindly backed this particular part of the project, it's taken on many forms, which I'm going to ask Cathy to kind of expand on. But I'd just like to say, Cathy has put a huge amount of hard, physical, dirty labor into this. So, Cathy.
Hi, good afternoon. I think most of you know me, but if you don't know who I am an archaeologist. I stay on Coigach, which is just over the water here. And although I work as a commercial artist, I really enjoy doing community projects. And it was with Julia's help, filling in all the paperwork, that we managed to get the very helpful funding from KELP that's allowed us to do the project we've been doing. But of course, it was a community project that just got started when COVID happened. So it has been in many ways very frustrated that we've not been able to do a lot of the things that we intended to do at the time. So if you were to come back in a couple of years' time, we maybe will be able to give the results of the entire project. But anyway, what we've done so far is not been a complete waste of time. But I noticed that today I'm included in the art and seaweed afternoon, which is fine. So I'm going to start off by showing you some art. And there are some images here, starting with one done by a famous artist called Coigach, of people gathering and burning seaweed, most of these are in Brittany, dating between the latter half of the 19th century and the early 20th century. At the time when the kelp burning industry was a fairly huge industry still, and a lot of artists were really inspired by the visual imagery of what was going on. I don't know whether any of these images have been shown today already.
This one is.
Yeah. The kelp cutting girls. A lot of them do seem to have been stricken by the Amazonian nature of the women and the women's work.
Well, that's good.
I can't remember the name of all the artists, I'm sorry. If you really want to know who any particular artist is, come and see me later on. So they were recording as their inspiration, their visual imagery, the cutting and carrying, and then the process of burning, again, the imagery of the fire, the heaps of seaweed, and then the muscular men with all the laboring. You could almost imagine these days they would actually have them stripped down to their rippling muscles. And then the very dramatic work at night when they're doing the second phase of stirring the kelp. This is actually a print, it's not a photograph. And then similarly to Brittany, there was an industry in Ireland that was recorded by Jack Yates, who was the brother to the slightly more famous now W.B. Yeats. And he did these beautiful compositions, again, the women carrying these huge, huge bundles of kelp. And I'm surprised that she's not knitting at the same time, but this particular one, she isn't. And then the lovely little details of the bucket and the mug on this one. And then the sleeping child in this one, I think, is just such a lovely little image. But what's going on? Why are these people doing all this back-breaking work in the first place for all the artists to come and sit and lounge about and do their sketching of them? So that was the art. And now I'm going to do, not too difficult, but leave at this point, if you don't want to know, a bit of the science. So what has been going on at the time that this whole industry kicked off? So we're talking about something that really got underway around about the 1750s and 1760s, the time of huge change in Britain and in the world. So I've put lots of arrows between all these different elements, but I could have put lots more of links across and possibly put kelp in the middle. But we've got the expansion of the British Empire. We've got the establishment of slave plantations that needed feeding, that needed clothing. Those empirical places are sending the raw materials to Britain, where they have to be processed in factories, which is the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution leads to urbanization and a huge urban population that also needs feeding and clothing. War is a huge factor. You have war is not only bringing together people in armies that have to be fed and clothed, but also, of course, war is having an impact on what materials can be imported and exported, what happens with trade, and whether or not raw materials have to be sourced closer to home, which is what happened with the kelp industry when it all started. Britain was just at war all the time and couldn't get materials from Europe that otherwise would have been available, so had to look to Scotland, for example, to get these raw materials such as kelp. So kelp plays an integral part in this entire interconnected cycle. What did you call this sort of cycle of chain of events? A commodity chain. Thank you. This is a commodity chain. So seaweed, obviously it's in the sea. The sea contains so many elements and minerals, and also the underlying rocks that the seaweed is growing on contains various rocks and minerals, all of which are absorbed into the seaweed, that then brings it to a form in which we can start thinking about how to extract these minerals and elements into something that we can then take off to be used in the industrial processes. So the most important one, we're talking in the 1760s, was sodium carbonate. So here's the little bit of chemistry, Na2CO3, more commonly known as soda ash. You might know it yourselves. So this is used in washing, very simply, where it's known otherwise as lye or niter or just washing soda. It came into its own as an element in the bleaching of linen, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And as Fionn has described, it was very important in glass manufacture. So the next important, this is about the linen industry. So linen obviously was much more important fabric before cotton became commonly used. And everybody had to have their linen shirt. So here is how, even in the north of Scotland, just about everybody had their linen shirt. It started off as just a very local cottage industry. Everybody would just have their little patch of flax growing, and they would be producing just enough for the family. Every year they would grow enough to produce, for example, a shirt to give dad his new shirt. But once you're having to produce linen on a massive scale, it's got to go into a factory and become a factory process. People like their shirts to be white, not the natural color of linen, which is actually a very pretty sort of browny gray color. So linen is bleached. And when it was a cottage industry, the bleaching was done just by laying out the fabric on the ground. The sunshine and water would do the job. But then the linen goes into the factories. And this print here from the 18th century shows the bleaching process when it's now an industrial process. And in the corner, you see somebody poking down a huge vat. This vat is a combination of the linen and water and the sodium carbonate, which has come from the kelp industry. And I think that it was effectively 2 boilings of about an hour each. And if you can imagine how much linen was now being produced for the armies, for the people living in the cities, and for export to the West Indies, where a coarse linen cloth was actually provided to clothe the slaves. So it became a huge industry, and there was suddenly a huge demand for sodium carbonate, and that demand was fed by the kelp industry, and this is how it all kicked off. But it wasn't just sodium carbonate. Our second element is potassium, which is also very easily extracted from the kelp. Potassium, you can make potassium nitrate, which is saltpeter, which then gets used in gunpowder. Oh, you remember, we're all at war, so there's a huge demand for gunpowder. But it's also used in the glass making, and I think I'm right in saying it's used as a hardening agent. Oh, there you are, sorry, you've got your mask on. Is that right, that potassium is one of the hardeners in glass? Instead of lime. Mm-hmm. And also it's being used as a glaze in porcelain and probably a hardener again in ceramics. And it was while a French scientist was experimenting with extracting potassium from seaweed ash that he discovered the whole new element of iodine in, I think, 1811. And iodine, of course, we all take it for granted now, but it wasn't actually even known as an element until it was found in the seaweed. And this is used in medicine in the treatment of goiter. It's used as an antiseptic, as a disinfectant. Later on, and then of course, when photography was developed, it was used in photography. But its extraction from seaweed was a real kickstart for the industry that went on in places like Orkney and still goes on in Brittany to the present day, pretty much. So we do have a little bit of documentary evidence as to how much kelp was produced. Now, you've all come to a festival of kelp. Kelp was originally not the seaweed. Kelp is the word that was used for the ash that was produced from the burning of seaweed. So the word that has now transferred itself to the seaweed itself was originally the material that we are producing during our kelp burning experiments. So it's burning for kelp, not the burning of kelp. And so the industry was known as the kelp industry, even though what we know as kelp now, which is the laminaria, was not the original seaweed to be being burnt. So all these figures here and the references to kelp in this period is actually referring to the burning of the racks. And I don't think they really discriminated as to which rack they were burning. I think they were all pretty much equally good to burn. So this is tonnage. And I think most of the figures here, I hope you can see some of them, refer to how many tons of kelp, not seaweed, are being produced each year during this period. Now, the ratio of seaweed as it's cut to kelp as it's burnt is 18:1. So when you look at these figures here, you have to think that every ton here has to be multiplied by 18. And that is an awful lot of tons of kelp, of seaweed that are being cut. But at this point, they haven't actually even included our own Coigach Loch Broom area. We do know, though, of course, that kelp was produced here. We've got two ways of finding this out. One is from the archaeology, which I'll deal with second. And this other point is from various documentary sources and newspaper articles and from some rentals. I want to start off with a little history of the Loch Broom area for people who aren't familiar with it. And it all kicks off with this character, who is the third Earl of Cromarty, who is the owner of the Cromarty Estates, and Cromarty Estates included Almartin and the islands up the coast here and all of Coigach, which went all the way down to include Ullapool to the border between Corrie and Leckmelm. So it's a huge area. He was a Jacobite, he lost, he went into exile. So his estates, all of this land around here, was being managed by a committee. And the committee were based in Edinburgh, the Committee for the Forfeit Estates. And their remit was given to them by the British government. It wasn't to be punitive towards the populations here. It was to set up industries that would actually improve the people's lot, but it would also pacify them, make them sort of less warlike, if you like, to break down the old warlike clan system bring them into the 18th century, make them workers, make them work for a wage. So instead of paying their rents, for example, in feathers or chickens, from now on, they would probably be told to pay in cash. And if they wanted to get cash, they had to work in the kelping industry. So the kelp shores of Coigach were offered for lease by the Commission for the Forfeit Estates. And the commissioners themselves wanted somebody who had capital, who would come in and they would be able to pay the wages of the workers. They would be able to organize the transport. Is there some feedback happening there? Is it okay?
Finley.
Oh, it's Finley. And would organize the sale of the kelp down wherever the factories were, which was either the Central Belt or it was even further afield down in England. And this is the first newspaper advertising of the leases of Coigach here in 1769. And two gentlemen applied. One of them was a merchant in Edinburgh. He was called William Borthwick. And the second one, Colin Mackenzie, described himself already in 1769 as a kelp merchant based in Loch Broom, which suggests that maybe there had been some previous kelping going on in the local area. And it would suggest that he would probably already have his own boat. And I think that probably it was Colin Mackenzie took the lease. And the reason I don't know is that I can't get into the archives of Scotland, which are in Edinburgh because of COVID. So I am just desperately waiting along with so many other people for the archives to be opened up to us. But I'm sort of quite low priority for getting back into there. So here's the first lease in 1769. So that would have been taken, and then the kelping industry would have been running for 30 years when the leases are offered again. So it would have been a 30-year lease. And this time they specify that it's not only Coigach, but also the farms of Achterskalt, which is the old name for the bit of Dundonald, which is just around the shore where the hotel is now, around Dundonald Hotel, Mickle Grinyard and the island of Grinyard. All of these places did actually belong to the Cromarty estate. And they're pointing out here that the kelp here is very valuable. We have a third one here in 1820, and this is the last one I find. And I don't think that they actually found anybody at this date to take up the lease. And so I would say that this is the last reference to the Coigach kelping industry. So our first is 1869 and our last is 1820. So how much kelp was actually being produced? I hope you can read this. This is what's called a shipping list. And this is made at a port of entry. This one happens to be down, I think it's Liverpool. And it's recording the fact in the newspaper that a ship called the Providence, whose captain is MacLeod, has arrived from Almartin, which is here, carrying 149 tons of kelp, as well as 21 packs of wool. This is 1794. So this is probably the entire year's production from the whole Coigach area. Loch Almartin is used because this is the place that the big boats can come in. So although it's being produced all around, it would have been brought to Almartin and unloaded onto the shore here as a collecting point to then be carried down the very pier that the painting is going on down there, to be loaded on the big ships that would take it down to the factories. So 149 tons. Now remember that that's 449 tons of kelp, which is 149 times 18 tons of wet seaweed cut, which I think is over 2,000. Can anyone do the quick maths? It's over 2,000 tons of wet kelp. Well, I mentioned this to my husband as, yeah, that sounds like quite a lot of hard work. And he said, well, that wouldn't have taken me very long. But then he hasn't actually tried cutting and carrying like I have. I have carried
exactly.
Yeah, it's wet.
We can vouch for that.
Even if you wait until it's low tide and the tide's been off it for a long time, it still drips. And when you put it on your back, it just drips down your back, and it's really, really hard work. Thank you. 2,682 tons of wet kelp. So where were the kelp kilns? There we go. So I hope you all recognize this bit of Coigach and Tanramore. If anybody's not from this area, it's just a little bit north of here. So if I put my finger about here, this would be where our Martin is. And all of these, I think we have 10 sites, or the sites that we have identified so far. I think this is only a few of them. And we haven't even yet been to see them all and verify them. Some of them are quite hard to find, quite hard to see. Some of them we go to and say, really, are they not? We don't know. This is now turned into archaeology. You can look at something and think, could be, but really we wouldn't know unless we excavated it, which we haven't done yet. It was part of the project we were hoping to do, was to get a nice small excavation done. We'll do it, we'll get it done someday. But as you can see, they're all fairly scattered around the coast. Where the kelp kilns are isn't necessarily where the kelp is being cut. So the cutting is on the rocks where it grows at its most prolific, but the kilns tend to be at a place where you can get a boat in, just a small local boat. So I think what they have been doing is they would go out with their boat, cut on the rocks and fill up their boats. Then they would be able to bring the boat in several times to the beach and unload it there. And that's where they would make their kilns. So what's the first one here? A lot of them are on the islands, because the islands in those days, if you traveled by boat, were quite easy to get to. The ones on Ristel Island, I took this photograph maybe 20 years ago, at a time that I didn't even know that kelp kilns were interesting. So I just said, yeah, kelp kilns, snapped the photo and moved on. I'd love to go back, so that's on my to-do list. The top one is actually a satellite image of the storm beach at Old Dorney. And it's immediately quite obvious that there is a circular feature that looks like a moon crater on the beach. Hope you can all see that. Yes, can you see that there? Yeah. But in fact, that's only the biggest one of about 6. So we've been to look at those ones. Here they are. When did we go? This was in May. May. We went out in May. And considering that these are over 200 years old, they're remarkably well preserved, because they are just shallow cavities made in the top of the storm beach, and the stones piled up as low walling around them. And people have been walking along past them all the time. While we was there last, we saw teenagers jumping into them. When we were at the next site we were going to visit, we picked up the debris of what had obviously been quite a party. And there was cans, there were bottles, there was a sleeping bag, and they just used the kiln to pile all the rubbish in. And yet these kilns have survived. But I think it is quite important to record them now, because they are actually fragile. And because nobody's looked at them, we're not recognizing all of them. So we're aware that we need to do quite a lot more work. But when we got to this site, we were really pleased that, there they are. There are our kelp kilns. There's another site of, I think that's the largest one at Old Dorney. And they seem to come in pairs. There seemed to be a large one and a small one. I don't know whether that was significant. It's not something we've seen at other sites, but we need to go back and see whether they were using different kilns at different times. This is a very similar one, and this is at Garvey Bay, which is a place quite a lot of you possibly go for a picnic or a swim or to gather seaweed, and have probably never noticed these. They're just at the top of the beach before it gets into the vegetation. And we made a plan there of some of the features. So what we've just been looking at here is this largest one here. And then there seems to be a bit of a platform area, almost deliberately made. Then we've got two other circular features. We've got a rectangular feature. Then the beach drops away quite steeply. And then away about maybe 100 meters or less to the north, there was a rectangular platform, which was probably the remains of the kelpers' hut, because they would have been sleeping there probably overnight and taking some turns to do the kelp burning. So this plan was done by Holly here and by Kevin Grant of Historic Environment Scotland, and I held the tape. Just moving away from Coigach and Cromarty a little way, I've got one to show here, which is not very clear, so I shall run my little arrow over them. If you can make out, there are circles. Can you nod if you can see these?
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is at Annett over on the Coigach side. This is just below, that's the burial ground up at the top. And there's a grouping of about 4, and then another grouping of 2, and then you cross over the stream and there's a grouping of 2 more. And they're quite close to the shore. They're the same dimensions as the ones that we were seeing that weren't covered in grass. So I am working on the hypothesis that these are also kelp kilns. And any day now, I am going to take the turf off and just see what's underneath. But I've been saying that for a year already, and I've just not gone round to it. And I'm not going to do it until every last midgie has gone away, because as archaeologists, we know what it's like to put our faces down in the soil when there are midges about. So now compare these ones we've just been looking at with this, which is a known and identified kelp kiln from the Scilly Isles, right down at the other side of the country. And we even have a print here from Northumberland of one of these small circular kelp kiln pits actually being used. And the old lady there is piling on the kelp. But at a slightly later development, I think having used a pit that might have been the sort of pit that was being used on a very small scale for a few hundred years just to produce soda ash domestically, there was a need for a slightly more sophisticated kiln. And I think a lot of it was to do with controlling the airflow. And so we get a much more rectangular structures starting to be used. And this one is on the Storm Beach at Polbane, which I haven't actually been to see yet, but you've been to it quite a few times. And this is a rectangular trench, very like the examples here, which you find all over the Highlands and Islands, but more on the islands than actually on the mainland. A couple here from Canna, Tiree and Ardnamurchan. And I think you also see these in Orkney. You also find the circular pits in Orkney. You can see the rectangular ones in Ireland, and you find these rectangular ones in Brittany. And when they do their kelp burning reconstructions in Brittany, it's the rectangular ones that they're using. And there's a sophistication here that they're putting in these stone, I would call them maybe baffles, that divide up the kiln into compartments. And this is because if you get it right, when you get it right, your kelp is rock hard and you have to break it up to get out of the kiln. So if you've already got dividers, then it's much easier to get your lumps out. So it's about time we thought we did it ourselves. So let's build a kiln. And we chose a spot on the back beach here. Probably most of you have all been over to have a look. I hope you have. It's still there, so go and have a look at it. I think actually we can blame Steve Twitchett here for saying this is the good spot to build a kelp kiln. We started digging, this was in late May and June, and thought this is really easy digging, it's peat. And it took us a while to think, just a minute, we shouldn't be putting a kiln onto peat. In June, in one of the driest Junes that we have had in years, we're just going to set the whole island alight. But anyway, actually, we rather foolishly possibly persevered, because actually it was very easy digging and it took no time at all to build the kiln. So we just thought, well, we'll have lots of buckets of water around. We'll be fine. We'll be fine, touch wood. And here are our lovely volunteers, carried the stones up from the shore. And what we created was one of the slightly earlier shallow circular kilns, just guessing at the dimensions. And just as a little sophistication, we added a flue to channel some air in, which I think now, had we done it again, we should have done it a lot deeper. Had we done it again, we should have done it down on the Storm Beach, which is something else again. So we've got our kiln. Now we need our fuel. So this is actually on Scorig, and this is where I cut my kelp from, and it's just down at the bottom of the croft. So whenever there was a good spring low tide, I could just nip down and cut a trug or two or three and lug it up on my back. And that was hard work, but quite handy to do. But we also had a neighbor helping. And this is how you can cut the laminaria if you wait until there is a really low spring low tide. The laminaria is actually exposed right down to the holdfast. So you can just wade out in wellies. You can just get a good handful and then you can cut it at just the right height above the holdfast and then chuck it up. But on a normal low spring tide, which is when I decided a bit later on to go and cut some laminaria, I had to wade in to mid-thigh, and then I had to bend down into the sea with my knife and feel around until I could grab some of the laminaria and then cut it. And luckily it was July and August, so it was quite warm. But, and also I was not wearing the big black skirts that women would have had to be wearing 200 years ago. But of course, that's cutting the laminaria, and the racks are much easier to cut because they're exposed at so many more low tides because they're much higher up the beach. And I was a bit concerned that I might be creating bald patches on my shoreline. But in fact, by the time I had cut as many buckets full as I was going to cut, I could look down the beach and couldn't even see where I'd been cutting. So that was a slight relief. We did some cutting all together at Old Dorney. I don't even know who that is, but Irene. That's Irene. But thank you to everybody that came along that day. And we laid out the seaweed on the rocks there. Is this you? I've stolen this from your Facebook page. So here's the seaweed being laid out on rocks to dry. If you lay it out in May or June, it takes a matter of days to dry before it's ready to burn. I put it on my fence and I laid it out on rocks, and very, very quickly it turned from being green to being brown to being black and really crinkly and dry and ready to burn. And is this your washing line? Such a lovely picture. I love that picture, so I had to put that up. Such a shame we burnt all this. Yes, the beautiful orange seaweed, and we burnt it. Now, this is a trug, which weighs 2 stone. I weighed 1 trug and it weighed 2 stone. In a moment, I think I'll be able to tell you a trug is, 2 stone is 12 kilos. So I was able to carry up 12 kilos in a trug at once. 2 stone, if you want to carry a ton of seaweed up, just remember your 18 tons to 1 ton ratio, that's the number of trugs you have to carry up the beach to have 1 ton of just freshly cut seaweed. So when you look at, we realize our experimental burns were a fraction of what they would have been burning. Now we know that the larger the burn, the better the burn, because it's all to do with temperature. So we move on to our first experimental burn. We were slightly limited in not having very many documents telling us how to do it. There is not a manual how to make kelp. There's nobody that wrote their memoirs of, I was a kelp maker and this is how I did it. So we've had to glean little bits from here and there. And obviously there are some accounts from Orkney of this is what we did. And again, the Breton, if you can read French, there's a reasonably good Breton account of how to do it. And so we sort of had a rough idea of how to get started, but it was very much, well, what do we do next? What are we doing wrong? But remember, it's an experiment. Experiments by their very nature, you try once, you have results, the results aren't what you want, you think, where did we go wrong? Where did we go right? Let's do it again. So we've started off quite well. It's very much like burning charcoal rather than having a bonfire, in that we know that you exposed flames. It's quite important that as you're putting your seaweed onto the fire, you're waiting for a flame to appear, and then you put more weed on and more weed on. So it's building up a really hot core and not going up in a great big oomph. It's a long, slow, hot burn. And our first burn took us, I think, 6 hours. And at the end of that, the heat of the core of the burn and the heat that had been absorbed by the stones was phenomenal. You could just stand well back and put your hands out, and it was really hot. And I wish we'd had some way of measuring what that temperature was, because that was, which we now know, which we didn't know then, is when all the alchemy happens. So you can burn seaweed and you get burnt seaweed. And it's a bit like charcoal. It's quite nice charcoal. You can do art with it, but it is not the calcinated to get. So this was our first mistake. We created an incredibly hot core of material on an island with peat in June, where it's bone dry, where we had to leave the island at 4:30 because it was the last ferry. So what did we do? We broke it open and cooled it down. And we discovered that was the worst thing we could have done, because the alchemy had not happened yet. And if we'd stayed with it and tended it and kept the heat up, and maybe even pushed air into it to keep the heat up and let it cool down really, really slowly, I think we would have produced a lot more kelp that first time. But there you are, it's results of a sort. It was very beautiful to watch. It was, it's sort of, I think the word is royals, the smoke coming up through the seaweed. We've got film of it somewhere, but it was mesmerizing to watch. However, it stank. And as I mentioned, it was a lovely hot sunny day, and lots of people had come over to the island to enjoy the sunshine. And what did we do? We covered the island in a pall of stinky smoke. And there were complaints. And that's partly the reason why we didn't do the burn. We didn't want to do the burn on one of the 2 days when you were all here, because we wouldn't have been popular. It lingers on your clothes. It gets into your hair. My waterproof coat that I was wearing still stinks after 3 months of burnt seaweed. I went home and you stink. But actually, that is not the dirt part of it. But this is what we were trying to produce, and we did produce some. So you can see the difference here between the outer part is the charred seaweed, and the inner part is this strange white, what words have we been using to describe it? Almost vitrified material. It's very hard, it's very gritty, and it's also very gritty. So that's, I'm going to share the love. I'm going to share the dirt and pass a bit round so that you can all see that this is not just charred seaweed. You pass another bit round. You've got to give it back because it's very precious. Because this is what Fionn's going to be making her glass with. And smell it, please smell it.
Taste it.
Yes.
Please taste it.
Yes, if you like, just don't eat too much. So this is the material that was collected by the ton. and it was taken down to the factories. And what we don't know anything about is how they actually then extracted the various elements that they wanted from it, or how fine they had to grind it down, and how did they grind it down before it could be used as the bleaching agent or the agent in glass. So there is a whole next step of the industry that we've not yet found anything about. Our second burn was on Friday. We wanted to do it in September, which is stupid. You do not do kelp burning in September. You do it in June. In June, the seaweed dries. It's a lovely dry atmosphere. There's a nice bit of wind. There's no midges. Your ground is dry and you can get the heat up. If you cut the seaweed in a typical Highland August, even if it doesn't rain, the air is moist. At night, there's a dew. You lose moisture from the seaweed during the day, and then it just sucks it all back in again at night because it's hygroscopic. So I cut loads of seaweed about 6 weeks ago, and it just would not dry. And everyone that did cutting for the experiment that we did on Friday found the same thing. You could get it dry, and then you'd come back to it and it was damp. So when we did the burn on Friday, with a lot more knowledge about how to do it, but the frustration was we just could not get the temperature up. So we never got to that point where we could stand back and go, whoa, such heat. But then again, we did actually get some kelp out of it. And again, we got our experimental results, and experiment number 3 is going to be so much better, but it's not going to be until June. So that is me for Seaweed for 2021. And that's about all. Thank you. No. If you want to see more.
Oh, thank you so much, Cathy. That's just brilliant. It's so lovely to see all the interconnecting parts and the whole kind of the background historically and economically of what was going on in the time as to why the kelp industry came about. Having done the end bit with you, it's really great to get a whole picture, and I'm sure there's lots of questions. We are running quite late now, but no. We'll take a few questions, but I would like to actually kind of echo your thoughts that when we do, I'm going to say when now, when we do our next festival, it's definitely going to be in June. Okay.
And we're going to build a kiln down on the
we
shore.
Certainly are. We're going to be in the splash zone down at the bottom, just above the high beach. Anybody got a really quick question that we could have? I'm sure there must be.
Quick one.
Yeah.
It wasn't an all year round.
No,
It really was early summer.
It was very much just at the time of year when you would want to be tending your crops, tending your garden, or out at the sheelings with your livestock. And because you were effectively forced into this labour, it meant that the gardens didn't get tended, the crops were neglected, and the whole sheeling system broke down. So it is actually quite a major factor in the whole breakdown of the Highland system that there was in the 1760s, before any sheep appeared.
So these great tonnages that went on the ships were from
one short season of 2 months, maybe. In parts of the Highlands and Islands, there's definite records of them doing it with big ropes, heather ropes, and you sort of twist it into the rope, and then you can throw it into the middle, and then you can just float it up on the tide. It depends how far you've got to take it. The other way to do it is just take your boat in and fill up the boat until the boat is completely piled high, and then take the boat around to the beach where you can get to shore. It was. It all went to the factories, which were either in the Central Belt. So there was a developing glass industry in the Central Belt, all the porcelain and pottery factories were in the Clyde or over at Preston Pans, or it went down to cities like Liverpool. So any of the big cities that were developing industrial practices, it would have been taken down to whoever gave the best price for it. So it was generally just taken, first of all, down to the big ports like Leith or Greenock, and then it was offered for auction at that point. So the kelp leaseholder wouldn't have had to actually take it as far as the factories. He just had a product. He took it to the market and said, I've got 149 tons of kelp. Who's going to give me the best price for it? And then the glass manufacturers would have said, I'll pay £2 a ton or whatever. Partly the need for the great quantities of sodium carbonate and potassium came to a fairly abrupt end when the Napoleonic Wars finished. And it was just all to do with the dynamics of trade, because it was found that it could be imported cheaper from Spain. So, you know, it's like New Zealand lamb. You can get it. It's not good. It's not economically, it's not environmentally sound. What?
You say it's not good.
It's not. What, New Zealand lamb?
Yeah.
It's not good. Bringing lamb all the way from New Zealand when I have got perfectly good. Anthony, okay. You know what I mean?
I do.
Yes. So it was the same. It was cheaper to buy Spanish imported, and the industry just collapsed. And lifting import taxes, lifting of barricades. And it took off in places like Orkney a bit later on, when they realized how useful the iodine was. But it never took off again on the mainland in the same way. So that was an end. And that's why it's fallen out of memory. And there are no folk stories, there's no mythologies, there's no traditions of my great-great-grandfather was a kelp burner. It's just so long ago that it's just forgotten around here. Yes, in Orkney, it's basically a living tradition still. It was on a smaller scale because people always needed things like soda ash for their washing. And soda ash is mentioned in the Bible. It's called, I think it's called niter if it's in the Bible. And it just for washing, for making soap, you know, just again on a very small domestic scale. And I think this is why there is no manual as to how to make it. Because when they came and said, right, you're going to be a kelp burner, people knew how to do it pretty much. So they didn't have to be told how. Well, thank you all very much for listening. And did we get our 2 lumps back? Bring it back. Don't run away with it. Here's one. It's been a run. Oh, thank you. Okay. Did everybody get a chance to? Yes.